I don't give a shit what the number says. So there you go. If you're the number one contender, it means nothing. If you have upset the brass, if you have upset the company, the promotion, you're not fighting for the belt. So it's not the best fighting the best. It's not the number one contender fights the champion. It's if you are in their good graces at that moment in time, you will fight for the belt. Just ask Arman Tsarukyan. And by the way, this has happened before. UFC 177, Renan Barão loses the title to TJ Dillashaw. He is scheduled to fight TJ Dillashaw in Sacramento, UFC 177. On weigh-in day, he slips, he hits his head, he's ruled out. Joe Soto steps in to fight TJ Dillashaw. Renan Barão has to fight one fight. He beats Mitch Gagnon, he beats him, he gets another crack at TJ Dillashaw.
I've only ever done what the UFC's asked me to do, and every contract they've put in front of me I've signed. I've never missed weight, I've never pulled out, I've never fucked a fight up like some certain dickheads. So, you know, that's probably the reason I'm in this position now.
Let's start with this, because for as much as you get for people saying like, oh, he might not deserve it, this and that, you've always said, you're like, look, bro, I fight whoever's put in front of me. Whatever name comes in front of me on a contract, that's who I fight.
You know, I'm going to turn up and I'm going to fight.
What do you think about that? So I guess we're not going to mention his name, but
Posh boy.
well, yes, but because there's a lot of people advocating for him. But do you think because of what had happened with the Islam Makhachev fight, even though he just beat Dan Hooker, he headlined, he's kind of been slid out of the way?
It's not even just that though, is it? You know what I mean? People talk about my last 3 wins. Yeah, it's Tony Ferguson, who was on his way out. Well, Dariush looks about 65. You know what I mean? He's got a full head of grey hair. He beat Dariush. He didn't beat Charles Oliveira.
I said, okay, I'm not fake like you. He's in the live, one person, in the social media, another person. I don't want to be fake. I'm real. If I want to say something to you, I'll say the same thing, you know.
Do you have any idea what's going on with him right now? He hasn't fought since June, and we don't know, Charles has fought.
He's trying to find easy fight and to defend that belt and go up. And UFC trying to make him to be a superstar and defend the title. Because right now he cannot go up to the 170 because he didn't defend the title. Why he gotta go 170?
This was absolutely shocking. Not a single person saw it coming. Not the diehard fans tracking every development in the lightweight rankings, not the elite fighters sitting ringside watching everything unfold, and definitely not the matchmakers who thought they had the entire picture mapped out perfectly. But the exact second that Arman Tsarukyan decided to withdraw from what everyone assumed would be his moment to capture UFC gold. The entire landscape of one of the sport's most competitive divisions transformed in ways that are still reshaping careers today.
Charles had Gamrot, and Justin didn't have anyone, so I thought it could be Justin, and then it just never ended up panning out, lad, but it's ended up working out. So,
what would be a bigger press conference, Paddy Ilya or a guy that's rumored to be coming back, Paddy McGregor?
Definitely be McGregor, like, you know what I mean? Ilya's a Timu version of McGregor, you know what I mean? He's a cheap version.
Listen, I think that's about it, man. You're going to see him headline at UFC 324 against Justin Gaethje for are we going to call it the official UFC lightweight champion? Let's start with this, because for as much as you get for people saying like, oh, he might not deserve it, this and that, you've always said, you're like, look, bro, I fight whoever's put in front of me. Whatever name comes in front of me on a contract, that's who I fight.
I've only ever done what the UFC's asked me to do, and every contract they've put in front of me I've signed. I've never missed weight, I've never pulled out, I've never fight up like some certain kids. So that's probably the reason I'm in this position now.
And you were like, I want my first UFC lightweight title defense to be against Ilia Topuria. So the way things have panned out, you're viewing this fight against Justin Gaethje as the actual UFC lightweight title.
What started as what looked like another routine injury withdrawal, the type of unfortunate situation that happens constantly in mixed martial arts, slowly evolved into one of the most politically explosive and controversial stories that the lightweight division has witnessed in recent memory. And here's what the casual audience never gets to see in those private conversations happening at UFC headquarters. This decision triggered something way more significant than simple scheduling headaches. It sparked what people close to the situation genuinely describe as a deeply personal conflict that Dana White has been nursing ever since he got that devastating phone call.
Interesting is when they use the UFC as the example, as our great friend New York Rick pointed out on social media a couple times, they'll use the UFC as an example of saying, like, look, in the UFC, the number one contender fights for the belt, and that's how it will be. That's how it will always be when we're in charge. As we know, it's never been like that, especially not now. It's worse now than ever. Just ask a guy named Arman Tsarukyan. And so you'll have a situation where last week, Nick Khan is telling all the media that he spoke to, in the UFC, the number one contender fights for the belt. And you have Arman Tsarukyan, who is the number one contender in the UFC's lightweight division. Not only is he not fighting for the belt next, he is not even in the interim title fight to determine who's the interim champion, and we suspect that the interim champion will then fight the champion. And when asked about that, what does Dana White say? I don't care about the number. If you ever had any indication, if you ever wanted to know truly how meaningless...
The part that should grab everyone's attention, that one critical moment of stepping away, didn't just postpone Tsarukyan's seemingly inevitable championship opportunity, which everybody thought was locked in. Instead, it potentially completely rewrote the trajectory of his entire fighting career, in ways we're just starting to comprehend fully. And if you really analyze how Dana discusses him in press conferences now, if you watch his facial expressions, listen to his tone, study his word choices, the underlying message becomes absolutely unmistakable. Whatever truly went down in those behind-the-scenes conversations that evening, whatever was said or left unsaid, Dana White hasn't moved past it, and he's ensuring that everyone in the MMA world understands his position.
About this situation. He spoke about it in the post-fight press conference. Let's take a look at what he said. He talked about Terence Crawford. He talked about the belt being taken away. He also talked about the TV deal. But for now, let's take a listen to what he said about Terence Crawford in particular.
Now here's what you need to grasp. To really comprehend why this specific situation blew up into such a massive controversy, why it transformed from routine fight business into a career-defining disaster, we need to go back to that precise moment when everything completely collapsed, because that's the foundation of this entire story. And that's where the animosity that continues to impact Tsarukyan's future first took root.
And if you look at how this thing's playing out, first of all, let me say this. I love that all these guys, all these boxing guys, love the Ali Act the way it is now. I want to see how many of them actually stay there and do that version of the Ali Act instead of the add-on that we're going to do. You know what I mean? You don't have to be a rocket scientist to see what's going on with all these guys. They're all these guys that are crying the loudest are the problems. They're the problem, every one of these guys. And, you know,
once you examine what followed and how everything unfolded, suddenly the whole puzzle starts coming together and you start understanding why the organization reacted so intensely and why Dana internalized it so deeply that he's still referencing it in interviews.
It was gotta be me. No way they can give petty people a fight. Everybody gonna laugh at them because I'm number one contender. I proved it again. And, what do they want from me? And I went there, performed, just destroyed Dan Hooker, and they want to put the guy who is...
The ranking situation becomes crucial here. When Tsarukyan placed that call and bailed on his enormous title opportunity, the chance that was meant to establish his legacy and demonstrate he belonged among the division's absolute elite. This wasn't simply a calendar adjustment that the promotion could smoothly handle. This represented a complete organizational nightmare from every business and marketing angle. Consider what they were suddenly confronting. They found themselves desperately scrambling with no headliner for their pay-per-view of no contingency plan. Because nobody maintains a backup ready for championship fights, and enormous pressure from every stakeholder to somehow rescue the entire card without disappointing fans who had already purchased tickets and booked flights. That's exactly when Renato Moicano, who wasn't even training for competition and had no fight preparation, volunteered to accept the bout on incredibly short notice, which represents enormous risk in professional fighting. And this is where the financial damage gets severe. The UFC had to authorize a truly massive, and when I say massive, I mean absolutely enormous emergency payment just to persuade Moicano to accept that danger and preserve the event. We're discussing an emergency compensation package that far exceeded his typical purse, the kind of desperate money you spend when you have zero alternatives. That crisis situation and that huge unplanned payout really bothered Dana White. It bothered him tremendously. What did you think of the WBC stripping Terence Crawford of his belts? Rumors spreading through the organization from sources with inside access suggest that the entire situation felt like calculated manipulation to Dana, like somehow he'd been cornered into an impossible position. Dana, who absolutely despises being caught off guard by fighters or put in situations that make him appear incompetent, interpreted this whole scenario as personal humiliation on a global stage. You need to understand he had spent weeks actively promoting this matchup, building excitement with media and supporters, positioning Tsarukyan aggressively as the next breakthrough star in the lightweight division, the hungry contender, ready to challenge for championship gold. And then, without any warning, the challenger had vanished, leaving him to face the music, trying to explain to everyone what went wrong. Staff members who witnessed Dana's reaction described it as immediate bitterness, like you could actually see something break the precise moment that phone call arrived, announcing the fight was canceled, like an internal switch got flipped that permanently altered his perspective on the entire relationship. Then, adding insult to injury, when Moicano stepped into that octagon, collected his absolutely enormous emergency payday that the UFC never planned to spend, and then got finished quickly in the actual contest, that made everything infinitely worse from Dana's perspective. In Dana's interpretation, everything about that evening, from beginning to end, felt like he'd been manipulated, like he'd been exploited during a vulnerable moment. Whether Tsarukyan actually intended it that way or not, whether this was genuinely just an unfortunate medical situation or something more strategic, no longer mattered to Dana. The harm was complete, the money was gone, the embarrassment was public, and the UFC, as anyone familiar with the organization understands, isn't an environment where incidents like that get overlooked or pardoned easily. Once all the chaos finally subsided and the aftermath cleared from that catastrophic fight night, Tsarukyan began doing precisely what any elite contender in his situation would logically do. He started engaging with journalists, campaigning loudly for the next championship opportunity, advocating hard for acknowledgement and respect from supporters and the organization, insisting on the chance he felt he had already legitimately earned through his octagon performances. On the surface, this appears completely reasonable. Correct? But here's the issue that Tsarukyan either missed or decided to disregard. There's an incredibly fine line, almost invisible at times, between displaying confidence in your capabilities and appearing entitled to opportunities. And within the UFC specifically, that boundary is extremely sharp, and crossing it brings serious repercussions. Behind the scenes, in discussions taking place in conference rooms and corridors at UFC headquarters, all that public campaigning from Tsarukyan didn't resonate well with the decision-makers. Many people throughout the promotion, from matchmakers to upper management, felt like Tsarukyan was behaving as if the entire division owed him something, simply for existing, like his ranking alone should guarantee him whatever opportunities he demanded. Rather than quietly rebuilding his standing through actions and performances, he amplified his public campaign in interview after interview. And here's what he failed to recognize. The more media appearances he made, the more podcasts he joined, the more he discussed deserving championship fights, the more it irritated and frustrated precisely the people who held the power to either grant him his wishes or make his professional life extremely challenging. Just listen to what he expressed in some of these media appearances, and you'll understand exactly the type of rhetoric that makes the UFC leadership significantly worse for his circumstances. Fighters who keep talking without actually competing, without maintaining activity and proving themselves repeatedly, typically end up on Dana's problem list quickly. And for Tsarukyan specifically, time was already running out because of that withdrawal situation. Every additional media comment he made, every new championship demand, every interview where he discussed what he deserved, only reinforced the growing perception inside the UFC that he considered himself above the system that every other fighter must work within. This violated the one absolute principle that Dana White has never accepted throughout his entire leadership of the UFC, and that's a fighter who attempts to operate like he's exempt from the promotion's rules. Like the standard expectations don't apply to him because of his abilities or ranking. But the real breaking point, the moment that ensured Dana would retaliate aggressively, occurred when Tsarukyan made the one strategic choice that was guaranteed to create enormous problems with UFC leadership. A fighter positioned at the division's top, especially in a weight class as competitive as lightweight, is expected by the organization to maintain activity and keep the division progressing forward. Compete at least twice annually, 3 times ideally, accept challenging matchups, continue building momentum, continue providing fans reasons to stay invested in your journey. But Tsarukyan went completely inactive for 18 months, with no competition scheduled, no momentum developing, no activity whatsoever, and no indication that he was urgently planning to return to competition. To Dana and the UFC matchmakers, this wasn't simple inactivity that could be attributed to injuries or personal circumstances. This was rebellion. This was a fighter attempting to use his ranking to manipulate the UFC's position. The UFC presented him with multiple different opponents during this time frame. Chances to compete and stay relevant, and according to organizational sources, he declined them. Not because he was seriously injured and unable to compete, not because of complex contractual disputes that required resolution, but apparently because he could financially manage to wait, because he didn't feel compelled to accept fights he didn't desire. But Tsarukyan is financially secure. He's comfortable economically in ways most fighters aren't, and he felt absolutely no pressure to risk himself unnecessarily. And in the UFC's perspective, in how the promotion interprets fighter conduct, having wealth doesn't purchase you privileges or special consideration. Actually, it creates enemies, because now you're perceived as someone who doesn't need them as desperately as they need you. And that power balance is something the UFC always seeks to maintain. During Tsarukyan's extended absence from competition, Charles Oliveira, a fighter who's considerably older, more battle-worn from years of conflicts, and with significantly more physical damage from a lengthy career, somehow managed to compete 3 full times. Meanwhile, Tsarukyan fought exactly 0 times, not once, and that contrast circulated rapidly through the MMA community. Supporters began asking direct questions on social platforms. Reporters started discussing it on programs and in columns, and you can be certain Dana White observed that too, because he observes everything that reflects poorly on the UFC. The longer Tsarukyan intentionally remained out of action, the more the UFC leadership viewed his absence as a calculated power play, like he was attempting to pressure them into providing him the specific championship opportunity he wanted, without having to earn it through activity. But here's what Tsarukyan apparently misunderstood about UFC operations. The UFC doesn't compromise for anyone, regardless of talent level, especially not for someone they already felt betrayed by after that withdrawal situation. By the time Tsarukyan finally returned against Dan Hooker in what should have been a triumphant comeback, the behind-the-scenes damage was already irreparable. Through one performance, even a clean, dominant victory wasn't sufficient to repair the relationship. The resentment from UFC management had solidified, had become integral to how they viewed him as both a person and business partner. And then Dana White finally addressed the entire situation publicly, in the most devastating and shocking manner possible. Dana White is recognized throughout the sports industry for being straightforward and not softening his perspectives. But what he stated publicly about Tsarukyan stunned even hardcore supporters who thought they'd witnessed everything from Dana over the years. When journalists posed the direct question of whether Tsarukyan deserved a championship opportunity based on his ranking and recent performance, Dana didn't hesitate for even a moment. Didn't pause to consider diplomatic phrasing. He said he didn't care, simply stated it directly, not about the victories Tsarukyan had accumulated, not about his position in the rankings, not about the quality of his latest performance. He made it completely clear it was irrelevant to him. His exact words, which I'm moderating slightly for platform guidelines, were essentially, "I don't give a damn," a statement so harsh and dismissive that it stunned people. A statement that personal and cold isn't typical in how Dana usually discusses active, highly ranked contenders. It's not casual matchmaking discussion. It's not standard business in UFC operations. It's personal, deeply personal, and everyone recognized it immediately. In one sentence, those few words informed the entire MMA community that something significant behind the scenes had fractured in the relationship between Dana and Tsarukyan. And if there remained any uncertainty in anyone's mind about how serious this situation had become, Dana made it even clearer in subsequent comments. He declared that Tsarukyan wouldn't receive a championship opportunity simply because the official rankings suggest he should be next in line, that rankings alone wouldn't determine his future path. Instead, Dana insisted that Tsarukyan needed to earn his chance again from the beginning, needed to prove himself completely over again. He compared it to how Petr Yan had to earn his way back into championship contention after losing his bantamweight title in competition Except here's the critical difference that makes this situation much harsher. In Tsarukyan's case, this wasn't about defeats inside the cage. Wasn't about his performance level declining. Wasn't even about his technical abilities being questioned. This was about punishment. Straightforward punishment for perceived disrespect and disloyalty. And when the UFC decides to punish a fighter when they really want to send a message, they don't conceal it or pretend it's something different. They deliberately slow their progress through the rankings. They obstruct obvious opportunities. They make the path back lengthy and exhausting and nearly impossible. Not because the fighter lacks skill or doesn't merit it based on ability, but because someone at the very top of the organizational hierarchy is delivering a clear message to that fighter and everyone else observing. And in Tsarukyan's specific situation, that message couldn't possibly be clearer if Dana announced it publicly. You crossed a boundary and now you're going to face the consequences. Once Dana made his personal feelings public in such a direct manner, the entire landscape and perception surrounding Tsarukyan shifted overnight in dramatic fashion. Before those statements, before Dana clarified his position, Tsarukyan was widely regarded as the fighter everyone expected would be competing for the lightweight championship relatively soon. He was the prodigy everyone discussed, the exciting future of the division, the one legitimate threat that people genuinely believed could give Islam Makhachev real, serious problems in a rematch, based on how competitive their first encounter was. But after Dana's brutally honest statements reached the MMA media, suddenly the message being communicated to the division and to supporters was completely different. The new message was clear. You're not next in line, you're not even close to a championship opportunity. And you're not receiving anything handed to you simply because you think you merit it based on talent or ranking. And the UFC's matchmaking decisions began reflecting exactly that new reality. Almost immediately, insiders with knowledge of UFC matchmaking started suggesting to journalists that Tsarukyan would need 2 additional fights, possibly even 3 more contests, before the UFC would even seriously consider offering him another championship opportunity. That's a requirement that no other top lightweight contender had been asked to meet in recent years under similar circumstances. Even Petr Yan, who Dana compared him to, who actually lost his championship belt inside the octagon in devastating fashion, only needed to win 3 fights before receiving another shot at gold. But Tsarukyan, he didn't lose a belt in competition. He didn't get knocked out or submitted. He simply lost his patience and made some decisions the UFC disapproved of. There's an enormous difference between those 2 situations, but the punishment is somehow even more severe. And here's the most frustrating aspect of his current situation that makes it even more challenging for him. Every single fighter ranked in the lightweight division's top 5 knows exactly how dangerous Tsarukyan is inside the octagon. They've analyzed his fights, they've studied his techniques, and they understand accepting a fight with someone that's skilled represents enormous risk with minimal reward attached to it, especially if he's not competing for a championship or in a number 1 contender bout. So now Tsarukyan finds himself stuck in this bizarre limbo, this professional no man's land that's incredibly frustrating. The UFC is publicly stating he needs to compete more to earn his way back, but the specific opponents he needs to defeat to advance won't sign agreements to fight him unless the UFC forces them to accept the matchup, which the UFC isn't particularly motivated to do. In other words, Tsarukyan is trapped in the most frustrating position any top contender can find themselves in. And it's not because of his abilities, not because his performances haven't been sufficient, but purely because of the politics and personal relationships surrounding him. And once those politics begin moving in a certain direction, once that narrative establishes itself, they're almost impossible to stop or reverse without something dramatic occurring. There's one matchup that supporters have been absolutely demanding since last year, posting about it constantly on social platforms, creating fantasy promotional material, debating how it would unfold: Ilia Topuria versus Arman Tsarukyan. 2 young killers at their performance peak, 2 rising stars who seem destined for greatness, 2 fighters who could legitimately become future champions. On paper, from a pure fighting perspective, it's absolutely perfect. It's the type of fight that would break social media and generate enormous numbers. But behind the scenes, according to people with knowledge of UFC thinking, it might be the one fight that the UFC has absolutely no interest in creating at least not anytime soon. Not because it wouldn't sell, because it obviously would generate huge business. And not because the supporters don't desperately want to see it, because the demand is clearly present, but because booking that specific fight would mean giving Tsarukyan exactly what Dana doesn't want him to have right now. It would restore his momentum, it would provide him visibility on a major stage, and most importantly, it would give him leverage in negotiations, and that's something the UFC carefully manages. Dana already feels that Tsarukyan manipulated him once, embarrassed him with that withdrawal situation, and he's not about to hand him a massive career-defining opportunity that could launch him directly back into the championship conversation like nothing ever happened. And here's the aspect that most casual supporters miss, when they wonder why certain fights don't materialize. Topuria is incredibly valuable to the UFC currently. As an asset, he's young and in his prime. He's charismatic and delivers great interviews. He's undefeated in the UFC with that perfect record intact, and he's a legitimate star in Europe and Latin America, which are enormous markets the UFC wants to develop. The promotion views him as a future pay-per-view machine, someone who could headline Madison Square Garden, someone they can build around for years. So why in the world, from a cold business perspective, would they risk all of that by putting him against someone as dangerous and unpredictable as Tsarukyan, especially when Tsarukyan is a fighter who Dana personally believes doesn't deserve the spotlight right now? From a business standpoint, when you remove emotion and just examine assets and risk management, the answer becomes obvious. They wouldn't take that risk. Not now. Maybe not ever. And that's exactly why industry insiders, people who understand UFC operations, whisper that the promotion will extend this conflict for years before ever allowing those two to actually touch gloves in the octagon. If that fight ever materializes at all, which isn't guaranteed, because as long as Dana White feels that Tsarukyan needs to be humbled, needs to learn his lesson about respect and loyalty, every single major opportunity will be carefully managed, every championship shot will be postponed, every super fight will be dangled just out of reach, every high-stakes matchup that could transform his career will be placed one fight away, always one more fight away. It's a method of reminding him, and reminding every other fighter, observing this situation, about who actually controls a fighter's destiny in this sport. And it's not the fighter, no matter how talented they are. The UFC operates on two fundamental elements that work together: skill and politics. You need both to reach the summit. And right now, at this exact moment in his career, Tsarukyan is caught directly in the middle of both of those forces. It's not the first time Dana has maintained a grudge against a fighter, not by any means, and it definitely won't be the last time we witness this pattern. The history of the UFC is absolutely filled with elite, incredibly talented fighters who ended up on the wrong side of the UFC president for various reasons, fighters who were forced into brutal matchups. They didn't want fighters who endured long layoffs, watching others receive opportunities, fighters whose timing was deliberately managed against them, or fighters who were never allowed within reach of the championship belt ever again despite clearly meriting a shot. Some of those fighters recovered and eventually made it back into Dana's good graces. Some didn't, and their careers were never the same. The pattern is always identical when you study these situations. If Dana feels betrayed by a fighter, if he feels like they showed him disrespect or attempted to maneuver around him, he pushes back twice as hard. And he has the entire organizational structure to support that. And Tsarukyan's biggest mistake in this whole saga wasn't the injury that forced the withdrawal, wasn't the year and a half of inactivity, wasn't even the attitude he displayed in interviews afterward. His biggest mistake was fundamentally misreading the balance of power in his relationship with the UFC. He thought being wealthy meant he could afford to wait for the perfect opportunity. He thought being ranked number one meant he could choose his opponents and timing. He thought being incredibly talented meant he could negotiate from a position of strength. But in the UFC's ecosystem, in the way Dana White has structured this organization, the fighter who tries to outmaneuver the promotion, who tries to play chess with management, almost always loses in the end, because Dana White has built an entire global empire, a multi-billion-dollar organization on one fundamental idea that he'll never compromise on. Nobody is bigger than the UFC. Nobody has more power than the promotion itself. And Tsarukyan is now learning that lesson the hard way, in real time, with his career hanging in the balance. Still, despite all the tension, all the politics, all the personal conflict between him and Dana, one thing is absolutely undeniable. when you watch him fight. Tsarukyan is special, genuinely special, as a fighter. His skill set is elite in every area. His potential ceiling is incredibly high, and his ability to push top-level competition to the absolute brink is something that even Dana White can't ignore forever, no matter how angry he is. So, the big question that everyone in the MMA world is asking becomes this. Can Tsarukyan actually fight his way back into Dana's good graces? Can he repair this relationship through performances? Maybe possibly, but the path he faces is absolutely brutal and unforgiving. He'll likely need at least 2 high-profile wins in the coming year against big names that the UFC chooses very carefully, opponents designed to test him. These will be fights that prove not just skill and technique, but loyalty to the organization, consistency in showing up, that fighting hunger that Dana wants to see, and activity above all else. He'll need to stay busy no matter what, even if the matchmaking feels unfair, or the timing isn't perfect. He'll need to show a willingness to say yes to difficult matchups without public complaints, without going to media and complaining about it. Because right now, at this stage, Tsarukyan isn't just fighting other contenders in the cage. He's fighting perception outside of it. He's fighting the narrative that's been built around him, that he's entitled and difficult. He's fighting the shadow of that moment he pulled out, which follows him everywhere, and most of all, most difficult of all. He's fighting against the sheer stubbornness of a man who has built an entire global empire by refusing to back down when he thinks he's right, a man who's defeated every challenge to his authority. But here's the thing that makes this story potentially amazing, if it works out. If Tsarukyan does pull it off, if he battles through all the politics, all the deliberately slow matchmaking, all the obstacles that will be thrown in his way by design, his comeback could become one of the most impressive and inspiring in lightweight division history. And maybe, just maybe, if he gets through this and earns Dana's respect back through pure determination, the feud that nearly destroyed his career and derailed everything he worked for could end up defining it in a positive way, could end up being the thing that made him great. When you strip everything else away, the story isn't really about an injury. It's not about a single missed fight. It's not even about money or contract negotiations. It's about pride, pure human pride on both sides, 2 people who absolutely refuse to budge from their positions, 1 fighter who believed he deserved more respect and better treatment, 1 promoter who felt personally disrespected and embarrassed in one moment in time that turned into a complicated rivalry that's actively shaping the future of the entire lightweight division and the careers of everyone in it. So now we're left with a single lingering question that only time will answer. Will Arman Tsarukyan rise again, fight through all of this, and get his championship shot to prove he belonged there all along? Or will Dana White's personal resentment and the UFC's political machinery rewrite the ending of what could have been a legendary career, turning a potential champion into a cautionary tale? Only time will tell how this plays out. But in the UFC, in this organization that Dana built, one truth never changes, no matter what else happens. The biggest fights, the ones that really matter, the ones that truly shape careers and legacies, don't always happen inside the cage where everyone can see them. Sometimes the most important battles happen in offices, in negotiation rooms, in personal relationships, and in the quiet decisions about who gets opportunities and who doesn't. And right now, Tsarukyan is learning that the hard way.